Our last panel is on resiliency planning, and it's probably going to be a little bit different than the others, not that they weren't all quite different from one another. Technology will certainly play a part in resiliency planning, but the different spin from the perspective of the future of the profession is really how we're dealing with some of these really big mega issues with regard to regional-wide systems and looking at watershed-based opportunities to integrate watershed management, for example. And in fact, John Phillips will be moderating the resiliency panel. John is the Director of Integrated Watershed Management at Parametrics and has worked in the water industry since 1999. John's background and expertise includes emergency and long-range planning, climate change science and climate adaptation, green infrastructure and co-benefits analysis, and he's also worked with several interagency advisory groups in Washington and across the West Coast. So with that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, we're going to be a little different because we're up here. I think Rebecca said all you water people are optimists. Well, we get to be the pessimists of the day because we're going to be talking about wildfires, flooding, earthquakes, maybe some terrorist attacks, cyber attacks. We're just going to make this afternoon really fun and exciting. This is the action-packed team. These are the Avengers. So what we're going to talk about really is resiliency. So what is resiliency and how does that get defined? And you can actually Google that, and it's all about psychology, how to be resilient, as a person. So you have to put resiliency and infrastructure to get the kind of quotations we're looking at here. Really, it's about not only designing to resist some sort of catastrophic event, but also the ability to recover from that event. And the reason we put this panel together is because they all said yes. That was the important part. And they wanted to fly in from Vicksburg, which Burton flied in from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And then Chuck came from Bellevue. So I'm trying to figure out who had the worst commute. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of giving you the context, and there's a lot of questions you can ask. But I think as the panelists speak and give their introductions, you'll get a sense of where we're going with this. It's really about building infrastructure that's safe, secure, smart, there's our connection, efficient, and sustainable. And each person on the panel, so we'll talk a little bit about infrastructure, their relationship with the infrastructure, what they did with infrastructure, and kind of a different take on infrastructure when we talk to Burton, because Burton's talking big infrastructure. We're talking massive infrastructure pieces that are really green and build coastal resiliency. And Chuck's going to be talking about our infrastructure. It's really important to all of us, which is the water. If you look at everybody, they say the first thing you do after a big disaster is you get your casualties, you make sure they get help. The second thing people want is water and power. And I think even Rebecca said that in the last panel. Most important thing is water and power. So how do we get water back and how do we get power back? Because you can actually, as a society, keep functioning with water and power. You can still provide medical service, make sure you have food, distribution, and kind of keep crime from escalating in the area. We've seen that in a lot of the disasters you've seen over the years, whether it's a wildfire in California, or it's a large hurricane hitting a major metropolitan area, or just general flooding that have caused all these different issues. So those are our threats. We get to talk about our threats, which is climate change, growth in our coastal regions. That's where most of the people want to live, is on the coast. All of you are here because you like living near water, I'm sure, or you like living in water, like this yesterday. Exponential growth in our ability to recover from catastrophic events. It's going to become more common here in the Northwest. I think we're still in that lucky period. We're not seeing huge issues yet, but we're getting closer. And kind of one thing we're going to all talk about is something that was mentioned quite a bit today, is actually the risk of global connectivity. All this connectivity, all these Internet of Things, all these open portals to sewer systems, water systems, power grids. What are the risks kind of going around that? Now, none of us are cybersecurity experts. That's our disclaimer. But we're going to play one on the stage. So with that, I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves, and some of them have slides. And Crystal will kind of round it out. And then Crystal's going to actually jump in, because Crystal's from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and talk about some of the climate change impacts that we see here in the Northwest. Even though Eleanor did an excellent job of kind of leading us in, Crystal's going to tell us what's really going to happen. So I'm going to start with Burton. Burton's from the Army Corps of Engineers for a program called Engineering with Nature. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of take a look at the infrastructure that Burton talks about.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that very much. Am I the only biologist in the room? All right. We're well represented. So I come at this as a research biologist. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, but I work with the Engineer Research and Development Center in Vicksburg, Mississippi. We are the R&D arm of the Army Corps of Engineers, and so that gives us, I think, a unique perspective in terms of how the Army Corps of Engineers goes about its business. It was a relatively short and eventful 9 years ago that we spun up this initiative called Engineering with Nature, which we have now trademarked. And the idea with Engineering with Nature is find ways in which the Army Corps of Engineers can go about doing their business, completing their projects in a more efficient, sustainable, and certainly resilient manner. And so this is what Engineering with Nature is all about. There are multiple opportunities, I think, in terms of engineering with nature. The graphic there at the bottom was really drafted to get a sense for what engineering with nature and natural nature-based features opportunities would be from a marine coastal perspective. But when you really look at it, I mean, what if you're in the Great Lakes regions? Are they worried about marine coast? No, they're worried about inland coasts. What if you're in the upper Midwest part of the United States earlier this year? Are you worried about those coasts? No, we're worried about all the flooding that we're having in our backyard right in the middle of the country. So there's multiple opportunities, I think, to engineer with nature. And if you look at the right-hand side of that graphic down there, almost everything there really kind of belongs to the Army Corps of Engineers. It gives us a lot of opportunities to engineer with nature, whether that be strategically placing or beneficial use of the dredge material that we have. We dredge on the order of 200 to 300 million cubic yards of dredge material every year. About 90% of that does not require special handling. That means we can use it for beneficial use. But the other data point that you need to know, we probably only beneficially use about a third of that. And depending upon who you talk to internally, perhaps even less than that. So we're not really taking advantage of the dredge material as a resource. So that is an opportunity for all of us to identify how that dredge material could be applied on that entire right-hand side of the graphic to not only improve the sustainability of our projects, but really to enhance the resiliency of those projects, and certainly in the coasts where those materials are placed. And this is part of the presentation where I had 20 or more additional slides talking about all the neat projects related with engineering with nature, but for some reason John took them out. So I'm working a little bit short-handed here, but instead of showing you a bunch of slides, I'm going to hold up a book. Just in the past few months, we published the Engineering with Nature in Atlas. This is 56 projects, 30 of those of ours in the Army Corps of Engineers. 26 of those are projects belonging to others, not only in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. The idea, even though I'm highly technical, I'm a research biologist, this is not typically how I communicate. I usually don't write coffee table books for technical publications. But in terms of who our audience is, this may be vertical team within the Army Corps of Engineers and with the Army, or it may include folks like yourselves. But sometimes we got to get outside that box and say, okay, how can we most effectively communicate with those that are should be interested in terms of what we're doing? And so that's exactly what we did. So I hauled this all the way from Vicksburg. I'd be very, very disappointed if I hauled it all the way back. So this is a copy to someone in the audience that is most interested in taking that home with them, particularly if you're not getting on an airplane. That was celebrating 9 years of engineering with nature. So we're going to be celebrating even more next year in 2020, because that's going to be the 10th anniversary of Engineering with Nature. So we're developing and certainly receiving nominations for projects to be included in the Atlas for the 10th anniversary. So I do have information on these cards. There's got to be at least one or two of you in the audience that has project ideas that would be consistent with Engineering with Nature. So I'll be glad to share those with you as well. So I didn't think I needed those 20 slides after all. Well, let's see. Other panels touched on this today, and I was really pleased to see that. But even within the Army Corps of Engineers, now these photos were taken actually internally within the Army Corps of Engineers, but I tell you what, that's just the tip of the iceberg. How does innovation happen in our organization? That happens with people talking to other people. Now, I've had conversations with others already today here in the room about, how we may effectively address these big issues related with resiliency and the concerns related to climate variability, if you will. And so how do we address that programmatically? And one of the best ways we found to do this, not only internally within the Corps, but also externally with our partners, with our stakeholders, with our collaborators, is getting them in the room and actually talking to each other. It's amazing how much we can get done, how much we can accomplish, how many big ideas we can develop just by getting together. It's generally smaller groups than this one in terms of co-developing those solutions. And so I think that's been a common theme throughout the day today, and so I want to leave that with you. And let's go on to Chuck and see what he has to say.
All right. Thanks for the introduction to Chuck. Chuck Clark from the Cascade Water Alliance. We asked Chuck to come and talk because he's working on the water systems within the Cascade region, but also because he led a study where we looked at the resiliency of our regional water systems, and a former CEO of Seattle Public Utilities, so the water provider for a lot of us who drink water, including this building. So Chuck?
Yeah, when you've been around for 48 years, you've held jobs most every place. So this just happens to be Cascade at this point. From a resiliency standpoint, resiliency is a pretty easy concept. I mean, do you know a level of service? Have you defined a level of service for what you want your utility or your entity to provide? Have you identified disruptive events so you know what the disruptive events are? Have you applied risk and consequence numbers in a time dimension to those disruptive events? Have you prioritized those disruptive events? Have you determined what investments you need to make to help mitigate the consequences of the events? And have you developed a plan for how you're going to deal post-event? I mean, it's not overly complicated to sit down and do that. It takes a lot of analytical work. It takes competent employees, competent scientists that know the issue well enough. But all of that is easy to do. The biggest problem is, what do you do after you've done all that? And there are a number of things that create intriguing and challenging problems to deal with resiliency. And I'll speak from a water utility perspective first. And I was intrigued by some of the responses. Since 1990, in the King County area, and Puget Sound's pretty consistent with that, there's been about a 35% population growth, and there's been a 30% reduction in the use of water. A 30% reduction in the use of water. What gets reduced when water gets reduced? Revenue. And so in the 70s and 80s, you do a 3% rate increase and you get 4 or 5% additional revenue. In the 90s, you do a 3% rate increase and you get 3%. In the 2000s, you do a 3% rate increase and you get 2%. And the challenge with it's not about water delivery, it's about all the capacity you've got under the streets you're trying to maintain. And so one of the biggest challenges going forward in dealing with resiliency and identifying, for example, in water, well, let's use the Japanese model for pipes. That means ripping out massive quantities of infrastructure and changing the delivery systems. And it is going to be exceedingly difficult to be able to do that going forward. Secondly, if you take the lowest quartile of your customers and you look at how much they're paying for water, most of them are paying between 7 and 12% of their total income. 7 to 12% of their total income today, and rates continue to go up. The disparity for affordability, when you're trying to figure out how to deal with a broad issue like resiliency, one of the big risks you have is how you're just going to keep giving basic services to a large portion of the customer base. And it's getting exceedingly difficult as a utility to try to figure that out. In many places in the country, enterprise funds prohibit the transfer of money amongst customer bases. It's not that case here, but in many places it is. And so now how are you going to start dealing with those people that can't afford to be able to pay for that infrastructure? And you're talking about huge new investments going forward. The third issue is the political system, governance structure. The governance structure for water utilities wasn't designed to deal with innovation. It wasn't designed to deal with change. It was designed basically to make decisions in 2 and 4 year windows of vision to deal with the elected officials that you're dealing with. There are always leaders that can transcend that 2 to 4 years, but it is very difficult to get people to focus on long-term decisions when you say to them, gee, let's do a 20% rate increase. That is not typically palatable when somebody is being elected every 2 years or every 4 years. I happen to be an elected official also. But it is a consequence that is very difficult for elected officials to deal with, and reasonably so. I mean, they're the ones that are dealing with the public. It certainly isn't the staff. I mean, this is what a democracy is all about. It's about the elected officials who get elected. I mean, that's the ones who the people are holding responsible, and so they are very discomforted by having to make major decisions that deal with that. And finally, from a resiliency standpoint, the water utilities in the country, many wastewater utilities in the country in general, are 10 years, 20 years, 30 years behind some other sectors in how innovative they are in looking at how to do things in a different way. I think that will change. There's a huge turnover going on now in the industry, and lots of new people coming in. But how do you stay, there's an interesting chart there, how do you stay competitive for employees going forward? If you're not going to pay salaries, then you better have something that's going to energize people. I have a 30-year-old daughter. She's changed jobs, I think, 4 times already. And every new job she loves. And she loves all the innovation they have, and she loves all the new things she's doing. Well, how does a staid old utility compete in an environment where you're not going to pay exceeding salaries? You try to argue maybe the type of job you're in, the kinds of good feelings you can get from delivering service, but that's a huge challenge going forward over the next decade. And the changing in the demographics of the workforce, the current utilities weren't designed to deal with more women, more people of color, more people with disabilities coming into the workforce. And that is where competition is going to be in the future for utilities. And if you're not prepared to be competitive, then you're not going to be able to be innovative, and you're not going to be able to accomplish. So although resiliency is easy to define, trying to figure out the solutions to figure out how to pay for that resiliency, how to deal with that. And maybe one final issue, since I used to run the State Community Development Department and Emergency Management, people's memory on disruptive events is between 1 and 2 weeks. Think about it. If you have an earthquake, there's always a whole bunch of activity. There'll be a whole bunch of activity legislatively. There'll be a whole bunch of activity within the local jurisdictions. And you give about 2 to 3 or 4 weeks, and people's memories begin to fade if it isn't significant enough. And therefore, you just can't move it forward. With all the work we did, we looked at subduction quakes on earthquakes. We looked at surface quakes. And if you get a subduction quake somewhere between 8 and 9, if you get a surface quake somewhere around 7.5, every customer, about 90% of your customers, are going to be out of water at the tap 30 to 90 days. 30 to 90 days. Do you think any of the customers know that? If you ask a lot of the utility staff, well, does the customer know that? Well, we know what the customer wants. Well, have you asked the customer? Well, we know what the customer wants. We have a huge disconnect now going forward to start dealing with some of these disruptive events and dealing with the investments that is necessary, and dealing with the fact that the customer is going to have to share, because they better be prepared at their home to deal with that. How many of you have at least 2 weeks supply of food and water in your home? 1, 2. I do. I've got 3 weeks. After I saw the study, I now have 3 weeks. I would tell you, you better have multiple weeks at home, or you don't even want to go to work because you're going to be worried about your family. So I think there are lots of challenges going forward in dealing with resiliency and resilient events.
Thank you, Chuck. So next up, Crystal's going to do two things. One, she's going to do her introduction, but she's also going to jump right into our first discussion questions, which are, what are some of the climate change impacts we're going to see here in the Pacific Northwest? So, Crystal, from the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group.
So yes, I'm Crystal Raymond. I'm a climate adaptation specialist with the Climate Impacts Group. If you're not familiar with us, we are kind of an applied research group within the university. We are also the state's resource for climate science and impacts information. So we work very directly with communities throughout the state to provide them with information on climate science, climate impacts, as well as information about how to do adaptation and resilience planning. And so I want to talk a little bit about the climate impacts for the Northwest. We had kind of a brief introduction of those, and I'll say just a little bit about what I would consider kind of the top 5 most relevant impacts for this group. And some of you have probably heard about these in more detail. I won't go into the science too much. I mostly just have pretty pictures of them. But before I do that, I also want to, I often start presentations with this slide. That climate matters, and I hope that over time this is sort of becoming an obvious statement, but I think it's a good reminder to think about how much our economy, our infrastructure, our natural systems are really all built around the climate of the past. There are so many sort of implied assumptions about the climate in the way that we build things and the way that we operate our water systems, our electric systems, our transportation systems. And certainly there's a lot of variability. Anybody who's been in the Northwest for a while knows that we deal with a huge amount of climate variability. But that variability is typically around an accepted mean. And the expectation is that that mean doesn't change. And that's really not the case anymore, right? I think the phrase came up mostly in the water sector was the notion that stationarity is dead, right? So it's the idea that not only is that climate mean changing as we move into the future, it's going to keep changing. It's not that there's a point in the future where we can say, okay, now we've planned for that future and we're there. It's going to continue to be a moving target. And that affects a lot of aspects of our economy and our infrastructure throughout the state. And so what are those major impacts? So sea level rise is certainly one here in the Northwest. This is an issue of just constant, our average water level rising, but it's also the coastal flooding impacts. So those major storm events happening more frequently. And saltwater intrusion. And so we know for a lot of our water systems or agricultural systems that that's a potential impact along the coast as well. Reduce snowpack. So I like this quote about the Northwest. So the Cascades and the Olympic Mountains have the highest fraction of warm snow anywhere in the continental US. So that's snow falling between 27 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So when we think about climate change, we're talking something about 4 to 5 degrees warming. Well, if you have a lot of snow falling at 31 degrees, it doesn't matter if you're going to get 4 to 5. Even 1 degree warming is going to push that snow into rain. And because our whole system of water storage, a big part of it is built around the storage within the snowpack, that's a pretty significant impact. And one of the main aspects of climate change that we expect to see is declining snowpack, starting at the lower elevations and then moving up in elevations throughout the Cascades and Olympics. Higher peak flows and more riverine flooding. So the reason, obviously, of not having that snowpack is because our winter precipitation comes as rain rather than snow. And so instead of being in the snowpack in a December storm or January storm, it comes as rain and causes flooding in the lowlands. And so we're seeing this also happen throughout Western Washington, increases in our peak flow events with flooding consequences. And another kind of contribution to the flooding event, and also a big contributor to flooding in the urban environment, is heavier precipitation events. So generally with climate change here in the Northwest, we don't expect the overall amount of precipitation to change that much. We probably will not notice that given our variability. But one of the ways we do expect precipitation to change is the amount of water that comes in a major storm event. So with atmospheric rivers or Pineapple Express storms that contribute to most of our riverine and urban flooding events, those are expected by the end of this century to come with about 20% more precipitation. And we already have a hard time handling some of those events in terms of the water runoff. And so that's probably the biggest change in precipitation that we will experience here in the Northwest. And then I think the last one that I would say is just these fires, landslides, mass wasting events, these sorts of events that we certainly have dealt with in the past. These are expected to increase in the frequency, in some cases maybe kind of the severity of these events. And so these have implications for our infrastructure systems, implications for our communities. That bottom photo there is the smoke. I can't remember exactly which year that is, whether it's 2017, I think it is, where the Puget Sound area had substantial smoke from wildfire. And so these are the types of events that are often dealt with within the emergency management context, and we certainly have a history of dealing with them. But the frequency with which we have to deal with them is expected to go up, as well as just the sheer number of events across the state. So I think those are all the slides I have, and I just want to maybe end with just a couple of comments. As John was saying, we're the pessimists, right? We have to be the pessimists. And I give these presentations a lot about climate impacts, and people often ask me, how do you stay positive? How do you stay optimistic? We know that giving people this information and just telling them about the bad things that are coming does not motivate change in behavior. And so we have to think about other ways of trying to be optimistic in the face of these sorts of impacts that we're expected to experience. And I think one of the ways that I feel optimistic is that we are getting a lot of requests for this information. And that makes me realize how much more people want to know and understand what's happening and start to think about how to plan for that. And we're starting to get requests from different groups. It's been kind of a cast of characters over the last 20 years, and that's starting to change. A lot of communities in Eastern Washington, a lot more rural communities. And we see that people are addressing these climate resilience concerns, and we definitely hear things like in those communities, people may not call it climate resilience. They may say, we know we're having more severe droughts, and they're happening more frequently, and we know we need to have our water systems planned for those more severe droughts and the loss of snowpack. And that's okay. Like they're going to deal with it that way, and their communities can get behind that. And people probably working a lot of times for the cities or the counties, they know it's climate resilience that they're dealing with, and they may not just be calling it that, and they're still coming to us for information to help with that. And then the last thing that I just wanted to say is about sort of the scale at which people are planning for resilience or adaptation. So we just focus on the impacts, not any aspects of reducing carbon emissions, but just in terms of getting people to plan for these sort of impacts, adaptation planning or resilience planning. And I did a quick kind of scan of the numbers in terms of counties, cities that had some sort of climate resilience or adaptation plan. And for Washington State, it's about 20% of counties, and about 20% of the state's population lives in a city or municipal area that has some sort of climate adaptation or resilience plan. So 20% is not bad, but it took us about 20 years to get there. And so if we think about getting the rest of the state there, that's maybe another 80 years, which puts us at 2100. And by that point, these impacts are going to be in full swing. So that's not going to work, right? We can't take 80 years to get the rest of the state up to speed. So there definitely needs to be some sort of acceleration in how we do resilience and adaptation planning across the state. And I think there's a lot of innovation, a lot of different ways that we need to think about how to get this type of work done faster.
Thanks, Crystal. So that's great, because that's a great lead into the first question, which I have for Burton to kind of start up, and you guys can weigh in. So resiliency planning. How do we make sure that we address the impacts, and how should we make sure the way that we address those impacts are sustainable?
Well, to add just a little bit of good news to what Crystal was saying, at least from the Army Corps of Engineers perspective, disasters represent opportunities. We talked about lack of funding so far today, and that's kind of a recurrent theme. And I do really, really like the idea, regardless what type of infrastructure you're talking about, whether it's waterborne transport or road and rail or even air. The fact remains that I think it's much tougher, I think, for us to identify and secure funding proactively to prepare for such events. You know, from the federal government perspective, what happens is when a severe storm or disaster happens, the funding therefore is made available shortly thereafter. And so the reality that me and others in the Army Corps of Engineers have, I think, is that's our opportunity. Okay, so if a disaster happens, it could be a hurricane. In particular, I'm thinking hurricanes, doesn't matter where they are. Okay, well, if a hurricane happens, what information, what data can we collect on the ground that helps us understand what worked and what didn't work? The idea is not to repeat the mistakes of the past, is learn from those projects that worked, and then not returning those coastlines back to where they were. But the idea is to make them more resilient going forward in terms of learning about what worked and what didn't work from our past project. And so in those ways, we can make a lot of progress, I think, going forward in learning from the past. And I'm certainly involved in a couple projects right now that are doing just that, incorporating aspects of engineering with nature, natural nature-based features to improve the resiliency of our coastlines while at the same time preparing for the next storm. Even though the next storm hits us right in the middle of the project, another 400-year storm happens a few years later. And so we have to worry about not only water coming from seaside, we have to worry about that water coming from the hinterlands, if you will, or from the mountains. And so we may have risk coming at us from both directions. And so disasters offer us opportunities, and we definitely need to take advantage of that going forward. I know that's a very reactive approach, but that certainly presents opportunities within the Army Corps of Engineers.
Thanks, Burton. Chuck?
Yeah.
So as we look at this, how can government, business, and NGOs ensure that resiliency is met for our infrastructure?
You know, I use an animal analogy, maybe back to the discussion from before. You know, the silly question that always gets asked when you're young is, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And I think at the end of the day, that what happens is people get so overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the issue that they get gridlocked on being able to make any decisions and being able to move forward because they're going, oh God, no, that's $10 billion, that's $5 billion. And the answer is there's risk every year of having a disruptive event, but there's chances every year of not having one. So the biggest thing you can do is trying to get people started on making investments, and even if it means starting very small. For Cascade, we got all the members to set aside 1% rates a year to start dealing with earthquake issues. We're going to get through that for a year or two. Now we're going to ask for another % to try and start slowly building it up. And the argument to them is, maybe you'll be lucky, and if you're elected official for 10 or 15 or 20 years, by the time the event happens, you can turn around and say, look at all the things that we did to try and get ourselves in position to deal with this. If you try to get them to move to the big issue, to the big question, to the billion-dollar question, it is almost impossible to get them to move. And so I would say just get started somewhere, get investments made somewhere. You know, when Crystal talked about high-intensity, short-duration events, if you walk on the streets out here, I'd encourage you to look at the storm events and look at the grates that are out there and how small they are and how they were designed about 100 years ago for a short duration, for high duration, low rain, kind of Seattle drip. And now we're talking about high intensity, short duration. So we got water issues, you've got stormwater issues, you've got wastewater issues because you're going to flood the system. We've just got all these investments to make, and if nothing else, just get started.
Bert, did you want to weigh in on that question, or on the NGO connection with government?
I think so. I think getting back to my last slide, in terms of realizing innovation, how important it is, I think, for us to talk to each other. You know, as I mentioned, those pictures were of us talking to each other. We're the world's largest engineering organization. It is possible, it does happen from time to time, that we don't do a very good job of communicating internally. So even doing that really helps. But what we do find out on a very, very regular basis, whether they be NGOs or federal partners or even the private sector, we have an awful lot in common. And just about every time that we arrange some kind of meeting or workshop and gathering these minds together, it's very interesting how quickly we identify certainly common ground, developing new ideas and find ways in which we can collaborate and partner together to realize how we can, you know, build those projects and improve not only sustainability but resiliency. So I think the key for us, certainly internally, is continuing to talk to people and to do that as much as possible.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to Crystal's past when she worked for Seattle City Light, and how you, we had a little discussion about how we talk about resiliency, cyber. One of the things we talked about, and I think both Chuck and Crystal can weigh in on this, is how do we diversify our sources, and how do we make those adjustments, and what infrastructure has the ability to kind of change where it comes from? In other words, you know, what's the backup to the backup?
Yeah, John, thanks for saying that. So I forgot to, in my introduction, I forgot to say that before I was at the university, I worked for Seattle City Light, and I did climate resilience planning for the utility, and I also did some for the Forest Service before that as well. But in terms of the electric utility, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I learned when I was there is how much when we think about kind of traditional ways of looking at climate resilience, it was often looking at the operations of reservoirs, or how do we store water differently. And what I quickly realized was that there is also a lot of resiliency in things like energy markets, and the way that we are able to move energy around the Western grid. And I think that there's that flexibility that can come in those systems is itself a way to deal with climate resilience and the climate issues in general. And I think, you know, the technology as well, so the greater ability to be looking at, you know, energy availability on very short timescales and how to manage that very quickly and efficiently is an efficiency that can help deal with some of the climate challenges that we expect to face in terms of you know, changes to when our supply is available relative to when the demand is there, the timing of electricity availability when it's coming from hydropower. So I think, you know, there's a lot of potential in the energy sector to use flexibility and technology as some of the solutions for the climate resilience needs, as well as looking at some of the more traditional ways that we think about it in terms of dams and how they're operated. And you know, how we harden our infrastructure in our distribution and transmission systems to make that more resilient to things like wildfires and landslides.
Yeah, I think you should try, from a strategy standpoint, the more you can move towards a kind of certainty with flexibility strategy. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you're doing your own investment portfolio, how many of you going off and saying, well, I'm just going to invest in this one stock for the rest of my life? And the rest of my life, I just know this is going to do okay. Well, that's great if it does really well. It's not great if it doesn't. And so from a utility perspective, from most perspectives, you really ought to try to be diversifying your portfolio and seeing what options might be available. It may be that it is the current supply that's available. It may be that if you look to the future, it's reclaimed water. It may be that if you look to the future, although it's always been an anathema to use Lake Washington, that Lake Washington becomes a supply source. If you look to the future, it may be that smaller scale developments of water supply can be used. If you look to the future, there's really no reason that the Seattle system, the Tacoma system, the Everett system aren't intertied. I mean, it's easy to move electrons in the electrical grid, why can't you move water within regions and be able to look at managing disruptive events that way, or maybe be able to get away from protecting your market so tightly, and be caring more about the regional customer base, so that you have the ability to optimize every molecule of water going forward. I mean, I've looked at some of the models, and you look out in the 2050s, 2060s, 2070s, you're looking at a snowpack of, I don't know, 10%, 20% on those models. The whole regional system in the Northwest was designed assuming you had a checking account and a savings account. And the checking account was that rain you got every day, and the savings account was that snow you got, so that you could, as Crystal said, you could balance the year. Well, part of that's going to go away. And so we are very water rich, even in the future. If you get high intensity events, you may have the same amount of rain. We are exceedingly storage poor. I mean, if you go to the Southwest, they're exceedingly storage rich and water poor. We're exactly the opposite. And so as you look to the future, how can you diversify to be able to take advantage of when the water is here, and then how can you take advantage of moving it around?
Thank you. I did threaten that we would talk about cybersecurity. I don't know if my panel was necessarily ready to talk about it. We did discuss it, but we're not experts in that. And I've been reading about Sandworm, who recently was able to hack into a small country's electrical grid and just flip the switch and turn it off. Any thoughts on cybersecurity? When we had all this discussion about the Internet of Things and all these great Wi-Fi devices everywhere, and maybe they're all centralized and they're contained, but there's other networks out there that are open. Any thoughts on that on the resiliency side, other than?
Yeah, it's exceedingly important going forward. The technology is changing so rapidly, and you're not keeping up. I mean, you have those discussions every day, and if you have a billing system, I mean, do you want everybody's social security numbers? Do you want their credit card numbers? How much risk are you creating for the utility? If you lose credibility as a public utility, will you ever get it back? I mean, they're exceedingly sensitive issues. Can they disrupt your whole operation system? Can they blackmail your operation system? The Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, which is the big water utilities in the country, set up an entire cybersecurity process that allows all of the utilities to be members of, so that you can get the latest information both on threats but also on ways of managing that security. It's a huge issue going forward that's hard to get a handle on, and to try to understand what the significance of those risks are.
Port representatives still here? I'm sure they can appreciate resiliency risk associated with hacking. There's been a couple, I think, of good examples around the world where that has happened. The disruption to the port, to the infrastructure, I think to the local economy can be really impressively large. And so there are concerns about that, I think, from the waterborne transport side of things, particularly related to ports. And so I think that is certainly an ongoing concern. I'm not sure how much that is locally, but I would imagine, given the size and importance of the ports locally, that's an ongoing concern, and one they're probably having to continue to work on and maintain that resiliency from that perspective.
I don't know that I could comment on the cybersecurity specifically, but maybe a sort of more broader comment on security, in that I think one of the recent reports from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, did talk a bit about how we've typically kind of thought more about climate and natural resource type impacts of climate change, and I think the information is getting better in terms of understanding how climate change and drought may relate to food scarcity or water scarcity, and the potential for general kind of unrest related to that, or even more, or that we're starting to see a more clear connection between that. And so I think that there is a security concern in general associated with climate change that is probably underestimated. And then kind of along those security lines, I do think that, despite some of the stuff happening in our federal climate, the Department of Defense is doing a lot of climate resilience work, and that is not, it may be getting, kind of changed in its name or how it's done, but there is a strong recognition from the Department of Defense of the need to address climate impacts because of the security implications of that. And so that still seems to be moving forward. So I think there's a broader security issue there. And those connections to climate change, I think, are really becoming more clear and helping people see the need to address climate change through that lens.
Yeah, the risk is real. I mean, we're talking threats to military readiness.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's whether you're the Navy in Norfolk, Virginia, or whether you're on one of the Pacific Islands, climate change threats are real. They may be different depending upon where you are, but in terms of military readiness, that is a big concern. I just like for our military to think that as an adversary. A lot of times we think our adversaries generally have two legs, and I think sometimes we forget some of the times the biggest adversaries may not have two legs. They may be climate.
My first workshop on sea level rise in the Western United States was attended by, I think there were 4 naval officers in the audience who actually gave talks on climate change and sea level rise and what the Navy was doing about it. So I want to thank the panel for participating and answering all my questions. Now I'm going to open it up to see if we have our electronic questions from the audience. All right, here we go. First question. How can water and wastewater utilities collaborate to address reduced climate change summer stream flows and still meet financial goals? Chuck?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is a movement going forward to try to figure out how to treat water as one water, and we haven't made very many inroads in that yet. In trying to sort out how best to deal with the interrelationships of wastewater, stormwater, drinking water, and all of the associated risks with them. There's got to be movement going forward to more collaborative efforts. We haven't transcended that yet. We haven't figured out a way to involve each other in making decisions in a broader perspective. It kind of gets back at that, can you make more enlightened investments going forward? And there's got to be a way to start trying to figure out a way to make more enlightened investments. I wish I could say I had the answer. I don't have the answer. But I think we're gonna be forced into this. In many instances, if the pressure's hard enough, you're forced to make decisions that will lead to a new level of efficiency and being productive. If you look at kind of Australia and New Zealand utilities, there was a risk about 15 years ago. The government came in and said, here's the deal, you're not efficient. We're thinking about privatizing all utilities in Australia and New Zealand unless you get efficient, and they became exceedingly efficient very fast. And really led the world in asset management and how to make triple bottom line decisions that really balance the social, economic, and environmental issues. We haven't been forced into that yet. And I think at some point we will, and we won't have a choice. Our customers can't afford to sit out there and say, well, geez, do I pay my electrical bill this month, or my water bill this month, or my wastewater bill this month, or my stormwater bill this month, or how am I going to be able to manage all this? And then to be honest, on top of that, most jurisdictions now decide to charge a utility tax so that they can fund the general fund. And we're talking about not being able to make infrastructure investments. Utility taxes in this state in some cities are 20%. In Seattle, they're 12.5% to 15%. They take that money off the top and goes to the general fund for general fund purposes, and yet we're talking about major needs for infrastructure investment. So discombobulated in the sense of having a rational approach to figuring out how to coordinate this.
Thanks, Chuck. So the next question, I'm actually going to have Crystal answer. A significant percentage of the population does not believe in climate change. How do we change the narrative to better educate the non-believers?
Yeah, it's a great
Non-believers.
Yeah, the non-believers. So one thing I would say is I would encourage you to check out the Yale School on Climate Change, the Six Americas, if you haven't seen that before. So they don't divide it up into non-believers and believers. They actually have 6 different categories. And on one end, you've got that percentage of the population that no matter what you say is never going to be on board. And then, of course, you got kind of the people who are fully there. No matter what you say, they're moving forward. They're dealing with it. And so there's more categories in between. And so I think there's a little bit, it's less maybe black and white than believers and non-believers. And so I think there's some different strategies. And one is what we're seeing in some more rural or more conservative areas where, in terms of the adaptation or the resilience piece, is you can talk about it and you can motivate action by kind of depoliticizing it without necessarily using the words climate change, right? And for a climate scientist, a person who's been working on this, sometimes that's hard to do, to say I'm going to give that up. But I think, if we're dealing with droughts and we're dealing with flooding and we're dealing with wildfire and we say these events are not going away, they're going to be happening more frequently, they're going to be more severe, that can kind of get rid of some of that political tone to the terms and help people to kind of move beyond that non-believing stance. I think the other thing that I would say is really connecting climate change impact to things like food security and our nation's security and bringing it back to being about people. I think part of the problem is that a lot of climate change impacts are really seen as, about the polar bears and happening in the natural world, and that just didn't connect with a huge amount of the population. And so I think there's the reminder that this is about public health, that this is about our own infrastructure and our well-being, and I think that helps bring it back to people and thinking about how you connect with different populations. I know here in King County and Seattle, there's been a ton of work about thinking about how you talk about climate change to people who are from different parts of the world, because what matters to them is different. Just to give you one example, for a long time, we always thought, we got to make these impacts as local as possible, right? We got to talk about what's happening here where you live, and that's what's going to resonate with people. And then we found for some communities that actually wasn't the case, right? They cared about what's happening in the region where their ancestors, where their families were from, where they still had a lot of family connections. And so for certain populations, it actually resonated a lot better to think about what was happening in those impacts in those parts of the world. And so I think there's also nuance to our communication with different populations that could really improve and help with that education piece.
Thanks, Crystal. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? Next question. How do you go about, or are we thinking about tomorrow's climate change and planning how we manage our water today, or is it more reactive planning? Go H2O. Nice. Nice handle. Chuck, do you want to tackle that one first?
It's a little bit of all. Yes, it's somewhat reactive, but on the other hand, I think the work that that's being done at the University of Washington, the work that Seattle Public Utilities has done at taking a look at scenario planning, and did some fantastic work on scenario planning. I don't know how much is still going on there, but they looked at kind of the international models. They downscaled the international models. They upscaled some of the local models and developed a set of scenarios going out through 2100 to really take a look at the risk to the system. At Cascade, we own Lake Tapps, we have the water rights for it. It's an undeveloped water supply. We're actually giving money to the National Park Service, because we found they'd been doing a lot of glacier work for the last 15 years, but didn't have enough money in their budget to publish the results. So we're actually partnering with them now, doing ongoing studies on the glacier. If you look at the White River, which is where Lake Tapps is, the diurnal nature during June, July, and August is almost all driven off glacier melt. So it contributes a significant amount. So how much risk do you have going forward? So we're involved in that now to say, okay, then how do we have to change operations of the system? And then finally, we're playing around now with how we operate the lake levels and the diversion levels and others related to minimum flows, temperature, lake levels, to try and see if we can start seeing the range of options we have on how we manage the system so that we can keep more dynamic and not stay static in the way we operate, so that as things change over time that we can't predict, we have the ability to adapt.
Thanks, Chuck. Next question. So the disasters we've been discussing all have the potential to impact transportation network, landslides, earthquakes. What can the transportation sector, do to build resilience? Well, we're water people mostly, so I don't know.
I could say a little bit about that.
But we do have a climate adaptation
Yeah.
specialist.
Yeah, no, I could answer that question a little bit. I mean, I think one of the things is recognizing, one of really good kind of recommendations I've heard lately is thinking more about the recovery of systems and how they're designed. So, I mean, this would hold also true for, say, flooding or, wildfire, some of these other impacts, right? We know that those events are going to happen, and I think some infrastructure design has really been around the notion of we're going to build to withstand disaster of a certain level, but now that's becoming a moving target, right? As our floods get bigger, then, we thought we were building for a 100-year flood, that was good enough, well, it might not be anymore. So I think one great recommendation that I've heard recently is thinking about the recovery part of how you build, right? So we're not gonna withstand, we're gonna accept that these sorts of disasters are gonna come, that there's gonna be an impact to that infrastructure, and how do we design it, consider that into the design such that we can recover or rebuild more quickly and make that a part of the process. And I think that would be a shift in the way that we think about building things.
One thing, we can't do a repair if we can't get to the site. I mean, so transportation is a critical component of any planning you're doing on water supply or wastewater supply, because if I can't get crews in, and if I can't get crews out, I can't get anything fixed. And so, although we narrowly talk about resiliency when we get all the water geeks in a room together, at the end of the day, it starts spreading out amongst all the other infrastructure issues because they all overlap on one another, and you can't address the issues unless you figure out how to deal with that. Transportation becomes actually one of the most critical components of how you respond in a significant earthquake event, because with roads and bridges and others, it creates huge disruptive events on its own that would make it very difficult to get water back up and running. Or in most cases, the biggest risk inherently at the beginning is related to fire. And if you have a significant enough earthquake, all you have to do is look at what's happened in Japan, look at what's happened in New Zealand, and what does that mean? You need to be able to get fire crews out, you need to be able to get water there. It becomes a critical component of any response mechanism you put in place if you're dealing with resiliency.
Related to that too, the word transportation network is a good part of that question. And we look at our reports, and I apologize for picking y'all again, but hey, this is the nexus of transportation. This is where waterborne transport, this is where road, and this is where rail meets. Okay, so those, and they're generally hemmed in because they're in high population areas, and so they are fairly at risk associated with these events, whether they be earthquakes or whether there be aspects related to climate change. And so I'm sure you guys are working with your multimodal partners and talking about how to solve these problems and how to move forward and really have a more resilient transportation system as these modes make connections in our ports and harbors.
Yeah, maybe I'd just say one more quick thing
Sure.
on that. So I mentioned this kind of 20% of counties or populations and cities that have resilience plans. So we do see a lot of climate resilience kind of popping up in individual places, a county, a city, but not a whole lot of regional connection. Or state agencies there's a lot of work going on there, but that's not necessarily connected to what's happening in the local community. And so another great quote that I heard was random acts of resilience. Like, unfortunately, that's a little bit what we have going on in Washington State right now are these random acts of resilience, which is great. It's a great place to start, right? You got to get started somewhere. But there needs to be more regional coordination of that, right? Because when you have one state agency kind of looking at their own sets of standards and ways that they're addressing climate resilience, and then the local communities looking at different numbers and thinking about climate resilience in a different way, then, you know, the fact that these things are all interconnected, that they are networks, then that's not going to build kind of long-term resilience. So I think that's another great way is to try to think about them more as networks and how we have more regional coordination.
And don't forget about windstorms. I don't know, there was windstorm, 10 years ago? That's when you guys started Wind Watch over at Seattle City Light. Yeah, where it impacted all the infrastructure. We were unable to get fuel to pump stations. There wasn't power. So the pump stations were going down without any backup power because we can get fuel to emergency generators. That windstorm that lasted, and I think that affected the region for almost a month, where we had, you know, Southern California, Edison come up. My wife worked in Bellevue, not to pick on Bellevue. She couldn't actually get home. None of the gas stations were open because the electricity power was down, and a lot of the roads were blocked, right? Because the trees and everything that was there was one of those windstorms that knocked all the trees down, and it took a long time for crews, both private crews who jumped in and started to help, and the public crews trying to get just the trees out of the way and the trees off that. So that was another thing to think about too, is something like a day-long windstorm that just basically shuts the region down. And the things to think about, like not having a full tank of gas. How many people let your gas get below half a tank? Good. Okay. Always keep your gas above half a tank, because gas stations don't work if there isn't power. Believe it or not, they actually can't give you gas if they don't have power. So let's jump to the next question, which has jumped. If money and bureaucracy were not an issue, yay, it's the end of the day. We can do that. All right. What would our infrastructure look like in 10 years from now to be best prepared for potential disruptive events? Anybody want to jump on that one? Well, I guess Chuck is the first one.
I can take a shot. Look, you know, the technology is starting to evolve out there related to water and wastewater infrastructure. It's available. It's a matter of money, and it's a matter of disruption. I mean, when you think about replacing infrastructure and dealing with customers, remember that it's not just the disruptive event that you're trying to fix for, but if you're going to start replacing all your infrastructure all over in the city, you're going to disrupt the lives of every resident in the whole area you're dealing with. And in many instances, if you go out and do polling data, and we used to do this in certain areas and say, you got two choices. We can come in and replace your older infrastructure, but we're going to be disruptive for 6 months in your neighborhood, or we can if we can let the infrastructure stay in place, and if it's disrupted, we'll come out immediately, we'll bring bottled water, and we'll repair that break within 24 to 48 hours. What would you prefer? And they almost all prefer let it break and come out and fix it. One of the bigger issues here is going to be the political issue. It's not just the money issue, it's the political issue of tearing up major streets, tearing up all of downtown Seattle to replace huge. When you look at the consequence and risk of pipes, the most critical pipes are the ones serving business and serving large populations of people. They're the ones typically in the corridors that you're all driving on every day, and they're the ones you'd be disruptive to try to replace. So the bureaucracy would be a little bit of a challenge to deal with that. But what you would be doing is just bringing in all the new technology that they've been experimenting with in Asia and experimenting with in other places related to infrastructure.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. The way that I see, kind of have a vision of the design changing is, you know, right now we're still very much looking backwards in terms of the climate information that we incorporate into our design. So we look at the last 30 years, the last 50 years, maybe even the last 100 years. And so I think in the design standards, we need to think about the changing the way that we look backwards and think about how do we incorporate forward-looking views of climate into the way that we design things. So I don't know necessarily what that means in terms of how the infrastructure itself changes, but it's being able to let go of that historical looking perspective and start to be able to kind of create these more flexible ways of thinking about design that allow us to look ahead, to use, modeling information data that we have about how things are changing, or maybe it's even just using a shorter historical record so we can capture some of that variability, so that as we design things, it's kind of more from that forward-looking perspective in terms of the underlying data that we're using in developing that design.
There's a fascinating example of Crystal's point in the Southwest when they were going and they were increasing their storage capacity. They thought at the last 100 years and thought they had done a really good job at taking a look at all the weather patterns over the last 100 years so that they knew that they could build enough storage to capture the events. And then several years later, I think it was National Geographic, published a study of somebody that had gone out and found petrified wood out in the desert. And they had done a cross-section of the petrified wood. And it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, 1,500 years worth of history. And what they found is the last 100 years was one of the wettest 100 years on record. And yet they had planned that as kind of normal because they had assumed that 100 years was the right amount. And I think that's the kind of issue that when you're trying to plan for this, are you going to do it over a 100-year history? Are you going to look at it the last decade and do decadal work and forecast it forward? How are you really going to try and make some assumptions about the future when you really don't know what the future holds? It's really intriguing and challenging for utilities when they're trying to figure out how to deal with climate change.
That's a tough question to a Fed. We got 10 years and tens of billions of dollars, federal taxpayer dollars to put into shovel-ready projects. I mean, that sounds pretty exciting. It really would be. I would tell you to read the book that I held up a little bit earlier, but that's what those projects would look like. Because when we would go in and help restore habitat or find ways to reduce flooding, we would design those projects to reduce the peak of the hydrograph while at the same time offering water storage, while at the same time providing value not only from an economic perspective but also from a social and environmental perspective as well. And so, we would essentially engineer with nature to the extent possible in just about all of our projects, regardless of where they were, whether it be marine coastal, inland coastal, or fluvial riverine. We would, on a very large scale, we would develop those projects. And I think we would have a very positive impact going forward, particularly longer term over larger scales.
And sorry, one more thing to add to
Sure.
that. All right. So I think some of the reaction to resiliency has been to build bigger, build stronger, right? We certainly saw that after Hurricane Sandy, and I think a lot of electric utilities were kind of focusing on this hardening, building stronger, building bigger. I mean, we think that maybe with the transportation system, bigger, stronger bridges. I also think there's an opportunity with some infrastructure to think about building in, smaller, more movable, flexible infrastructure. We know that the climate's going to be really different in 40 years, so let's not build something with a 100-year life expectancy. Let's build it with a 20-year life expectancy, and let's plan to move it or change it, and maybe that can even, in some cases, have a lighter carbon footprint in what we build, and that's just sort of a different way of thinking about things to try to get more flexibility into how that infrastructure is built. And I think nature-based solutions can certainly be a part of that. Other ways of just thinking about not having necessarily this big, strong, hard infrastructure that we've got to maintain for 100 years.
So no more Taj Mahals of wastewater. All right, next question. Private sector. What role can private sector play in financing the cost of resiliency infrastructure and operations?
Well, I just came out of a meeting with the private sector just last week on this very topic, actually. And I think what role the private sector can play, I think, is substantial. If you look at the private sector vulnerability, to impacts related with climate changes, for example, I think it's significant regardless of what part of the country that you're in. And so we met with them and an NGO, and we sat down and had a workshop and talked about how we could collaborate together and in terms of public-private type partnerships. What role can the Army Corps of Engineers play to help improve the resiliency of that infrastructure? Hey, when a big hurricane hits that petrochemical infrastructure in Texas, you know what happens, right? You know exactly what happens. And so it's not when that's going to happen. It's not if, it's when that's going to happen again. And so they're very interested in learning about these sustainable and resilient solutions. And so that they can play a big role in that in terms of partnering and collaborating with us.
Crystal, do you get a lot of the cast of characters that are private sector?
I think this is an area where we would certainly like to make more connections. I think the private sector has to play a big role in this, especially now. It's, we're not seeing the funding come from the public sector. And I think there's a lot more potential for innovation in the private sector, maybe more ability to kind of be nimble and change things and create even pilot projects that can be a model for public infrastructure. But I think there's a lot more momentum and recognition of the need to look at climate resilience in the private sector, and I hope that there can be a greater role for that. But I guess I'm not really sure what that looks like, but we're not getting the public financing, so hopefully there's an option there.
Yeah, look, there are opportunities there. I've had a lot of conversations over the last 20 years trying to look at that, and if it's pure investment, the question gets, where's the money? I mean, the utilities are not generating significant amounts of resources that they can figure out some way of financing some of their ongoing efforts. However, you can take when I worked in Vermont, Ben & Jerry's was very interested in trying to come up with innovative ways of dealing with infrastructure to deal with doing things in a different way than they had historically. If you look at the Microsoft campus rebuild that's going to go on in Redmond, I think it's about $5 billion or so. They're looking at doing things in a different way on site related to infrastructure. That's going to be their investment. They will have to work issues out with the city and the government jurisdictions after the fact, or during the fact. But they're looking at different ways of doing it. There have been efforts nationally. The original 30-30-30 program. Can businesses all sign up and use 30% less energy and 30% less water as they look by 2030? There are initiatives like that where they are actually investing in resiliency, but it's not an investment in the infrastructure that a typical municipal utility would be involved in.
Well, I guess we got to look at the way finances happen and bonding happens. Is that we were talking a little bit last night with some of the panelists from the previous panel, and they were talking about packaging bonds with the projects. In other words, you get the project put together, do you figure out the financing, which is another great way to look at how you finance things that don't necessarily have a ready investment, or an agency isn't willing to just take their capital costs and put it towards resiliency. I mean, a lot of, like you say, there's random acts of resiliency happening here in the Northwest. A lot of utilities are going, yes, we'll start putting that in. We'll think about it within our full capital portfolio, but it doesn't get the priority of, say, getting that pump station pumps replaced because they're 40, 50 years old, which could build resiliency because you're planning into it. Because we were just going to avoid the last question altogether. Is there any other questions? Actually, I learned a long time ago, I think when I was in college, that there actually is a design of a pipe from the Columbia River to Lake Owens, to supply Owens Lake, where they get the water for Southern California. I know it doesn't help you in Vegas, but you guys are okay. You'll find water. You'll make it.
I mean, the amount that we talk about drought here in the Northwest, I think is probably pretty shocking for most people. But we've had a number of drought years in the last 10 years, and so it's a matter of timing. But we have our own droughts to deal with for sure.
So again, thank you, Chuck, Urton, Crystal, for coming out here and spending part of your day or all of your day listening to the other panels, learning a little bit more, interacting with the audience, reading their questions, which was surprising. And we'll end on that question, which is just a great question to end on. Thanks, Bardia. With that, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sticking around.
I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time out today. It's been a long day, but really appreciate you carving time out of your schedules to participate in this. The doors are locked until you go back onto Slido and let us know, give us some feedback about this event and what we could do to improve it in the future. With that, I think we can call it a wrap. And again, thank you all very, very much.